The lone gunshot echoed through the vast Wyoming wilderness, startling a flock of birds into flight as Hazel Remington pressed trembling fingers against her husband's chest, desperately trying to stem the flow of blood that soaked through his white cotton shirt. The stagecoach robbery had happened so fast one moment they were traveling toward their new life in Valentine, Wyoming. The next, everything she loved was slipping away between her fingers. "Don't you leave me, William," she whispered, her voice breaking as his eyes, once so bright and determined, began to dim. "We have the children to think about." Spring of 1878 had promised so much a fresh start after the drought had taken their farm back in Missouri. Now, as the setting sun painted the distant mountains in shades of amber and gold, William Remington took his final breath in Hazel's arms, leaving her alone with 2 children and nothing but the clothes on their backs. The stagecoach driver and the other passengers had fled during the attack, taking the horses with them. The bandits, after discovering the Remingtons had little of value, had shot William in a fit of rage before disappearing into the wilderness. Now, as darkness fell across the open plain, Hazel gathered her weeping children, close 5-year-old Samuel and 3-year-old Grace, and wondered how they would survive the night, let alone make it to Valentine. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Hazel spotted a distant light moving across the prairie. Fear gripped her heart. Were the bandits returning? She hurried the children behind the overturned stagecoach, pressing a finger to her lips to silence their frightened whimpers. The approaching light belonged to a lantern held aloft by a tall figure on horseback. Behind him trailed several more riders, and Hazel's breath caught in her throat. But as they drew closer, she could make out the silhouette of a man in a wide-brimmed hat, his broad shoulders squared against the night. "Hello there," called a deep voice. "Anyone alive?" Hazel hesitated, clutching her children tighter before responding. "We're here, my husband." "He's been shot." The lead rider dismounted with fluid grace, approaching slowly with his lantern held high. In its golden glow, Hazel could see a weathered face framed by sun-streaked brown hair, kind eyes that crinkled at the corners, and a jawline shadowed with stubble. He wore the dust of the trail on his clothes, but moved with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to the harshness of the frontier. "I'm Thomas Grant," he said, crouching down to her level, "ranch owner from just outside Valentine. We heard the shots and came to investigate." His eyes moved to William's body, his expression somber. "I'm mighty sorry, madam." Behind him, 3 cowboys remained atop their horses, scanning the horizon for danger. "Hazel Remington," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "These are my children, Samuel and Grace." Thomas nodded respectfully, then turned to his men. "Judd, send Luke back to fetch the wagon. We can't leave them out here." As one of the cowboys rode off into the night, Thomas settled himself on the ground near Hazel, keeping a respectful distance. "Were you folks headed to Valentine?" Hazel nodded, absently stroking Grace's hair as the little girl dozed against her shoulder, exhausted from crying. "William had arranged work at the sawmill there. We lost our farm in Missouri." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "The sawmill, you say? That'd be Johnson's place." He frowned, pulling off his hat and running a hand through his hair. "Madam, I hate to add to your troubles, but Johnson's sawmill burned down 2 weeks ago. There's no work to be had there anymore." The news hit Hazel like a physical blow. No husband, no destination, no prospects, and 2 hungry children depending on her. Tears threatened, but she blinked them back furiously. She'd cried enough for one day. "I understand," she said stiffly. "Perhaps there's work elsewhere in town." Thomas studied her face in the lantern light, taking in her determined expression despite the circumstances. He seemed to make a decision. "My ranch has a small cabin that's sitting empty," he said. "Used to belong to our foreman before he married and built his own place closer to town. It's nothing fancy, but it's solid and dry. You and your little ones are welcome to stay there until you get your bearings." Before Hazel could respond, Samuel spoke up, his small voice trembling. "What about Pa? We can't leave him here." Thomas's expression softened as he looked at the boy. "We'll bring your Pa too, son. We'll see that he gets a proper burial with respect." The boy nodded solemnly, and Thomas returned his attention to Hazel. "My sister Alina lives at the ranch too, been helping me raise my boy since my wife passed 5 years back. She'd welcome the company of another woman, I expect." Hazel hesitated. Taking charity from strangers went against everything she believed in, everything William had taught her about self-reliance. But looking at her exhausted, frightened children, she knew she had no choice. "You're very kind, Mr. Grant," she said finally. "We accept your offer, though I insist on working for our keep." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "I wouldn't expect anything less, Mrs. Remington, and please call me Thomas." Within the hour, a wagon arrived, driven by a young man Thomas introduced as Luke. With gentle reverence, the cowboys helped wrap William's body and place him in the back of the wagon. Thomas lifted the sleeping Grace into the wagon bed, then offered his hand to help Hazel up. She hesitated only briefly before accepting it, noticing the strength and warmth of his calloused palm against hers. The journey to the Grant Ranch took over an hour, bumping along rough trails in the darkness. Samuel fell asleep against Hazel's side, but she remained awake, watching the unfamiliar landscape pass by in the moonlight, wondering what fate awaited them. The ranch materialized out of the darkness, a sprawling main house with a wide porch, several outbuildings and corrals. In the distance, she could make out smaller cabins where, Thomas explained, some of the ranch hands lived. "Your cabin's just beyond that stand of cottonwoods," he said, pointing to a cluster of trees silhouetted against the night sky. As the wagon pulled up to the main house, the front door swung open, spilling warm light onto the porch. A woman about Hazel's age stepped out, wrapped in a shawl against the night chill. Her resemblance to Thomas was unmistakable, the same kind eyes, though her hair was a shade darker. "Thomas." "We were getting worried," she called, then noticed the additional passengers. Her expression changed to one of concern as she hurried down the steps. "Alina, this is Mrs. Hazel Remington and her children," Thomas explained quickly. "There was trouble on the stage to Valentine. Her husband didn't make it." Alina's face softened with compassion. "Oh, you poor dear." She moved to help Hazel down from the wagon. "Come inside where it's warm. You look half frozen and exhausted." "I'll take Mr. Remington to town at first light," Thomas said quietly. "The undertaker there will see to things properly." Hazel nodded gratefully, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Inside the Grant home, Alina quickly set about making the newcomers comfortable. The house was larger than Hazel expected, rustic but well-appointed, with polished wooden floors covered by colorful woven rugs, sturdy furniture, and the pleasant aroma of home cooking lingering in the air. A boy of about 10 appeared in the doorway of what appeared to be a study, a book clutched in his hands. He had his father's build and coloring, but something in the shape of his face suggested his absent mother. "Pa, what's happening?" he asked, eyeing the strangers curiously. "James, this is Mrs. Remington and her children," Thomas said. "They'll be staying in the old foreman's cabin for a while. Mrs. Remington, this is my son, James." The boy gave a polite nod, his eyes lingering on Samuel with interest. Alina guided Hazel to a comfortable chair by the fire. "Let me fix you something to eat," she insisted. "You must be famished." Hazel started to protest, but her stomach betrayed her with an audible growl. Alina smiled knowingly and disappeared into the kitchen, returning moments later with thick slices of bread, cold meat, and cheese. As Hazel and her children ate, Thomas conferred quietly with Alina in the corner of the room. Hazel caught fragments of their conversation, concerns about the stagecoach bandits still being in the area, arrangements for William's burial, discussions about supplies needed for the cabin. When the meal was finished, Thomas approached Hazel again. "The cabin might need some airing out, but it's got the basics: bed, table, chairs, cook stove. We can help you get settled in the morning. For tonight, Alina's made up rooms for you and the children here in the main house." "I don't know how to thank you," Hazel said, the weight of the day's events finally catching up to her. "No need for that," Thomas replied, his voice gentle. "Out here, folks look after each other. It's the only way to survive." That night, lying in a borrowed nightgown in a strange bed, Hazel finally allowed her tears to flow freely. For William, for their lost dreams, for the uncertain future that loomed before her. But beneath the grief was a flicker of something else: gratitude for the unexpected kindness of strangers, and perhaps, though she hardly dared admit it to herself, a tiny spark of hope. The morning brought the harsh reality of William's burial. Thomas had been true to his word, taking William's body to the undertaker and Valentine before dawn. By mid-morning, he returned to escort Hazel and the children to town for the service. Valentine, Wyoming was smaller than Hazel had imagined: a single main street lined with wooden buildings, a church with a white steeple, a general store, saloon, blacksmith, and various other businesses essential to frontier life. The townspeople, having heard of the tragedy from the undertaker, gathered respectfully at the small cemetery behind the church. Pastor Daniel Morris spoke kind words about a man he'd never met, drawing on Hazel's brief description of William's life and character. As the simple wooden coffin was lowered into the Wyoming soil so far from the Missouri earth, William had loved Hazel stood straight-backed and dry-eyed, holding her children's hands. After the service, several townspeople approached to offer condolences and introduce themselves. The general store owner's wife, Martha Wilson, pressed a basket of food into Hazel's hands. Sheriff Frank Cooper promised to send word to neighboring towns about the stagecoach bandits. Dr. Henry Phillips assured Hazel he was available if the children needed medical attention. Throughout it all, Thomas remained close by, a steady presence at her side, neither hovering nor abandoning her to face the strangers alone. She found herself drawing strength from his quiet support. On the ride back to the ranch, Hazel finally voiced the question that had been pressing on her mind. "Mr. Grant Thomas, I appreciate your kindness more than I can express, but I must ask, what opportunities exist for a woman in Valentine? I have my children to provide for." Thomas considered her question thoughtfully. Valentine's growing. The railroad came through last year, bringing more settlers. The school needs a teacher, current one's expecting a baby and plans to stop teaching once it arrives. General store might need help, or, he hesitated. "My ranch could use a housekeeper." Hazel straightened her spine. "I'd prefer to find work in town. I don't wish to be more indebted to you than I already am." Thomas nodded, respect evident in his expression. "I understand. We'll ask around when we're in town next." True to his word, Thomas helped Hazel and her children move into the foreman's cabin that afternoon. The small structure consisted of 2 rooms, a main living area with a cook stove and table, and a bedroom just large enough for a bed and a small dresser. It was spare but clean, with windows that allowed light to flood the space. Alina arrived shortly after with bundles of linens, cookware, and basic foodstuffs. "To get you started," she explained, brushing aside Hazel's thanks. "James cleaned out the root cellar behind the cabin yesterday," Thomas added. "It's stocked with preserves and potatoes from last fall's harvest." As Alina helped arrange the cabin, she chatted easily about the ranch and surrounding area. Hazel learned that the Grant Ranch, known locally as Cottonwood Creek Ranch, was one of the most successful in the county, raising both cattle and horses. Thomas had inherited it from his father 15 years earlier and expanded it considerably. Thomas's wife Caroline died giving birth to their second child, Alina explained quietly while the children played outside. "The baby girl didn't survive either. It near broke him. That's when I came to help with James." "I'm sorry," Hazel said, genuinely moved. "It seems we share similar sorrows." Alina nodded. "Thomas is a good man, worked himself to exhaustion after Caroline died. Ranch is his life now, him and James." That evening, after Alina had returned to the main house and the children were tucked into their new beds, Samuel on a pallet near the cook stove, Grace sharing the bedroom with Hazel, there was a knock at the cabin door. Thomas stood on the threshold, hat in hand. "Thought you might need this," he said, holding out a small revolver. "For protection, it was my mother's." Hazel took the weapon gingerly. "I've never fired a gun before." "I can teach you," he offered. "Out here, it's a necessary skill." His eyes met hers directly. "I know you want your independence, Mrs. Remington, and I respect that. But please remember, you don't have to face everything alone. Not anymore." Something in his words touched a place inside her that had been frozen since William's death, a place that remembered what it was to accept help, to be part of something larger than her own struggle. She found herself nodding, unable to speak. Thomas seemed to understand. He simply tipped his hat and turned to go, then paused. James asked if your boy Samuel might like to join his lessons with Miss Aliner tomorrow. She teaches him in the afternoons. For the first time since the stagecoach attack, Hazel felt the corners of her mouth lift in the ghost of a smile. Samuel would like that very much. Thank you. The next weeks fell into a rhythm. Each morning, Hazel would rise at dawn to prepare breakfast for her children. Samuel would help with chores around the cabin, while Grace played with a rag doll Aliner had sewn for her. In the afternoons, Samuel joined James for lessons with Aliner, soaking up knowledge like a sponge. Hazel, meanwhile, made herself useful around the ranch, helping Aliner with mending, cooking, and preserving, insisting it was the least she could do in exchange for their shelter. Twice a week, Thomas would drive her into Valentine, where she inquired about employment opportunities and purchased small necessities with the meager savings she had managed to keep hidden in her boot during the stagecoach robbery. On one such trip, Thomas introduced her to Mrs. Abigail Henderson, the schoolteacher who was indeed expecting a child and looking for a replacement. I taught briefly in Missouri, Hazel explained. Before I married. Mrs. Henderson brightened. Oh, that's wonderful news. The school board has been at their wits' end trying to find someone qualified. By the end of the meeting, it was arranged that Hazel would observe Mrs. Henderson's teaching for several weeks, then take over fully after the baby arrived in August. The position came with a small salary and living quarters, a room attached to the schoolhouse. As they drove back to the ranch, Hazel could hardly contain her excitement. My own income, she said, more to herself than to Thomas. A chance to support my children properly. Thomas kept his eyes on the road ahead. You'll be a fine teacher, he said. Then, after a pause, though the children will miss having Samuel around for lessons. James, you mean? Hazel asked. James, yes, but Aliner too. She's grown quite fond of your boy. Hazel studied Thomas's profile, noting the tension in his jaw. The position doesn't begin until August, she reminded him. And even then, we would only be in town during the school week. Perhaps we could still visit the ranch on weekends. He glanced at her then, a smile warming his features. I'd like that. As spring bloomed into summer, Hazel found herself settling into life at Cottonwood Creek Ranch more comfortably than she had anticipated. The children thrived in the open air and freedom of rural life. Samuel followed James everywhere, learning to ride, fish, and identify tracks in the dust. Even little Grace blossomed, toddling after Aliner and helping feed the chickens with determined concentration. Thomas, true to his word, taught Hazel to shoot. Their lessons took place in a meadow behind the cabin, where he set up targets on fence posts. At first, Hazel flinched at every shot, but gradually she grew more confident, her aim improving under Thomas's patient instruction. You're a natural, he told her one evening as the setting sun bathed the meadow in golden light. Just like everything else you put your mind to. Hazel lowered the revolver, pleased by his praise despite herself. Over the weeks, she had come to value Thomas's good opinion, to look forward to their conversations, to appreciate the way he spoke to her as an equal. Hardly everything, she demurred. I still can't ride as well as I'd like. Thomas leaned against a fence post, considering her. We could change that. Proper riding lessons, I mean. There's a gentle mare in the barn that would suit you. Before Hazel could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of Samuel and James, proudly displaying a string of fish they had caught in the creek. Look, Ma, Samuel called. James showed me how to use a fishing pole proper. Thomas ruffled his son's hair. Good catch, boys. Enough for dinner, I'd say. That evening, the two families shared a meal together on the porch of the main house, as had become their custom several times a week. As the adults sipped coffee and the children played a game of checkers, Hazel found herself studying Thomas in the lamplight, the way laughter transformed his face, the gentle authority he displayed with the boys, the respect with which he treated his sister and everyone around him. It was dangerous territory, she knew. She was a recent widow with responsibilities, not some young girl free to indulge in romantic notions. And yet, she couldn't deny the warmth that spread through her chest when Thomas was near, or the way her spirits lifted at the sound of his voice. Eleanor, ever observant, caught Hazel's gaze and smiled knowingly. Later, as they washed dishes together in the kitchen, she spoke softly. "My brother's a different man since you arrived, Hazel, lighter somehow. I haven't seen him this way since before Caroline died." Hazel nearly dropped the plate she was drying. "Eleanor, no need to explain," Eleanor interrupted gently. "Grief has its own timeline, different for everyone, but life goes on whether we're ready or not." She squeezed Hazel's arm affectionately, "Just something to consider." July brought scorching heat and the busiest time on the ranch. Hazel divided her time between observing at the Valentine school 3 days a week and helping at the ranch. The children, oblivious to the adults' concerns, reveled in summer's freedom, swimming in the creek under Eleanor's watchful eye, building elaborate forts from fallen branches, collecting wildflowers and interesting rocks. One evening, as Hazel returned from the schoolhouse, she found Thomas waiting for her at the end of the road that led to the ranch. He sat atop his chestnut gelding, leading another horse, a dappled gray mare with a gentle eye. "Thought you might want to try that riding lesson," he called as she approached. "Unless you're too tired from teaching," Hazel hesitated only briefly before agreeing. Thomas helped her mount, his hands strong and sure at her waist, lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary. Under his guidance, they rode across the rolling grassland that made up the eastern portion of the ranch, Thomas pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of the land's history. "My father claimed this land when there was nothing here but buffalo grass and dreams," he told her. "Built everything from the ground up." "You've continued his legacy beautifully," Hazel observed, taking in the healthy cattle grazing on the hillsides, the neat fences, the thriving crops in the distance. Thomas looked pleased by her comment. "I try. Want James to inherit something worthy of his grandfather's vision." As they crested a hill, Hazel gasped at the view that spread before them, the valley below awash in the golden light of the setting sun, Cottonwood Creek winding through it like a silver ribbon, the distant mountains painted in shades of purple and blue. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," she breathed. Thomas was looking at her, not the view. "Yes," he agreed softly. "Beautiful." Hazel felt heat rise in her cheeks under his gaze and turned her face away, uncertain how to respond. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Finally, Thomas cleared his throat. "We should head back before dark." They rode in companionable silence, the horses picking their way carefully down the hillside. Halfway back to the ranch, however, Thomas suddenly reined in, his posture alert. "What is it?" Hazel asked. "Smoke," he said grimly, pointing to the horizon where a dark plume rose against the evening sky, coming from the direction of the main house. Without another word, he spurred his horse forward. Hazel followed, her heart hammering with fear. As they drew closer, they could see flames licking at the roof of one of the outbuildings, the barn closest to the bunkhouse where most of the ranch hands lived. Ranch hands were already forming a bucket brigade from the well to the burning structure. Thomas leaped from his horse and immediately took charge, shouting orders and joining the line of men passing water. Hazel dismounted more carefully and hurried toward the main house, where she found Eleanor on the porch with all 3 children, their faces pale with worry. "What happened?" Hazel asked, gathering Grace into her arms. "Lightning strike," Eleanor explained. "From that storm that passed through earlier. Must have smoldered for hours before catching properly." Thomas and his men fought the fire well into the night, eventually containing it to just the one barn. By morning, all that remained was a charred skeleton of the structure, but miraculously, no livestock or people had been harmed. Thomas, exhausted and smoke-stained, accepted a cup of coffee from Hazel as the first light of dawn broke over the eastern hills. "Could have been much worse," he said, his voice hoarse from shouting and smoke, "if it had reached the main house or the other barns. You prevented that, Hazel said firmly. Your quick action saved the ranch, he smiled tiredly. Not just me, everyone worked together. He took a long swallow of coffee, then added, including you, keeping the children calm and making sure the men had food and drink through the night. Their eyes met over the rim of his cup, and Hazel felt that now familiar warmth spread through her chest. In that moment, with his face smudged with soot and his eyes red-rimmed from smoke, Thomas Grant was the most handsome man she had ever seen. The barn fire marked a turning point. In the days that followed, as the ranch hands cleared away the debris and began rebuilding, Hazel found herself working alongside Thomas more frequently. She brought him meals when he forgot to eat, helped bandage his blistered hands, offered suggestions for the new barn's design that he listened to with genuine interest. One evening, as they sat together on the porch steps watching the sunset, Thomas turned to her with uncharacteristic hesitation. Hazel, he began, using her first name with careful emphasis. I know you'll be moving to town soon to take up your teaching position, and I respect your need for independence, but I wanted you to know, he paused, seeming to search for the right words. These past months, having you and your children here, it's brought life back to this ranch, back to me. Hazel's breath caught in her throat. Thomas, let me finish, he said gently. I'm not asking anything of you, not yet. You're still healing, still finding your way. But when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I want you to know that there's a place for you here. All of you. Always. Tears pricked at Hazel's eyes, not of sorrow, but of something more complex: gratitude, hope, and perhaps the first stirrings of a feeling she had thought buried with William. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Thomas took her hand, his touch light and respectful. You don't have to say anything, just know that you don't have to be alone anymore. None of us do. August arrived with sweltering heat and the birth of Mrs. Henderson's baby boy. As agreed, Hazel assumed full teaching duties at the Valentine School, moving with her children into the small attached living quarters during the week. The accommodations were cramped but adequate. A bedroom she shared with Grace, a small sitting area with a trundle bed for Samuel, and a tiny kitchen. The work itself was demanding but rewarding. Hazel taught 26 students ranging from 6 to 16 years of age, managing their varied educational needs with the same determination she brought to everything in her life. To her surprise, she discovered she had a talent for teaching, an ability to engage even the most reluctant learners and maintain discipline without resorting to harsh measures. As promised, Hazel and her children returned to Cottonwood Creek Ranch every Friday afternoon, staying until Sunday evening. These weekends quickly became the highlight of everyone's week. Samuel and James would disappear for hours, returning muddy and triumphant from their adventures. Grace followed Alina everywhere, soaking up the older woman's attention like a flower turning toward the sun. And Thomas watched Hazel with eyes that spoke volumes, his feelings increasingly evident despite his efforts at restraint. For her part, Hazel found herself looking forward to these weekends with an anticipation that both thrilled and frightened her. She told herself it was for the children's sake: the fresh air, the freedom, the wholesome food Alina prepared. But in the quiet moments when she was honest with herself, Hazel acknowledged that Thomas Grant had become essential to her happiness in a way she had never expected. One Sunday, in late August, Alina organized a picnic by the creek to celebrate the completion of the new barn. The day was perfect: clear skies, a gentle breeze, and the first hint of autumn in the air. After a feast of fried chicken, biscuits, and fresh peach cobbler, the children convinced the adults to join them in a game of tag that soon had everyone laughing and breathless. When they finally collapsed on the blankets spread beneath a stand of cottonwoods, Alina announced she was taking the children back to the house for ice cream. You two rest, she told Thomas and Hazel with a meaningful look. You've earned it. Left alone, they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the creek's gentle murmur and the distant calls of meadowlarks. Thomas picked up a blade of grass and twirled it between his fingers. School terms going well? He asked. Hazel nodded. Better than I expected. The children are eager to learn, and the school board seems pleased with my work. And the living arrangements, comfortable enough, adequate, Hazel replied honestly, though the children miss. She trailed off, unsure how to continue. The ranch, Thomas supplied. Yes, Hazel said softly. The ranch, the space, the animals, the people. Thomas turned to face her directly. Hazel, I've been thinking, the ride to town isn't so far less than an hour each way. What if you continued teaching but lived here at the ranch? I could drive you in each morning, or you could learn to handle the wagon yourself. Hope flared in Hazel's chest, but caution tempered it. The school board hired me with the understanding I'd live at the schoolhouse. The school board hired you because you're the best teacher they could hope for, Thomas countered. I doubt they'd object to where you lay your head at night, as long as you're there to ring the bell each morning. Hazel considered his words, turning the possibility over in her mind. It would be better for the children, she admitted. Especially with winter coming, the living quarters at the school get terribly cold, according to Mrs. Henderson. And what about for you? Thomas asked quietly. Would it be better for you? Hazel met his gaze directly. Yes, she said simply. It would be better for me too. Something shifted in Thomas's expression, a softening, a certainty. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he reached for her hand. When she didn't resist, he entwined his fingers with hers. Hazel, he began, his voice low and earnest. I know it's only been a few months since you lost William. I know your heart is still healing. But I want you to know that my feelings for you have grown into something I never expected to feel again after Caroline died. Hazel's heart pounded in her chest. Thomas, let me finish, he said gently. I'm not asking you for anything you're not ready to give. I just want you to know that if you ever feel ready to consider a future that includes me as more than a friend, I'll be here. Tears welled in Hazel's eyes. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Thomas squeezed her hand. You don't have to say anything. Just know that whatever you decide about living arrangements or anything else, you and your children have a home here for as long as you want it. A single tear spilled down Hazel's cheek. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion, for everything. Thomas reached up to brush the tear away, his touch feather light against her skin. No need for thanks between friends, he murmured, or whatever we might become. The following weekend, Hazel approached the school board with Thomas's proposal. To her surprise and relief, they readily agreed to the arrangement, with the provision that the school's living quarters be available for a future teacher if needed. With that settled, Hazel and her children moved permanently to Cottonwood Creek Ranch, taking up residence once more in the foreman's cabin. Thomas and the ranch hands helped make improvements to the small structure, adding a lean-to bedroom for Samuel, reinforcing the roof, and installing a more efficient cook stove. Each weekday morning, either Thomas or one of the trusted ranch hands would drive Hazel to town in the wagon, returning to collect her after school. On days when weather or ranch responsibilities made this impossible, Hazel would stay in the school's living quarters, having kept a change of clothing and basic necessities there for such contingencies. The arrangement worked better than anyone could have anticipated. Hazel thrived as a teacher, earning the respect of both her students and their parents. The children blossomed in the ranch environment, Samuel becoming almost as skilled a rider as James, Grace developing a remarkable affinity for the gentler animals. As autumn painted the landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Hazel found herself settling into a contentment she had never expected to feel again after William's death. The grief was still there, a quiet ache that flared occasionally on significant dates or when a particular memory surfaced unexpectedly. But alongside it grew something new: appreciation for the present, hope for the future, and feelings for Thomas that deepened with each passing day. Halloween brought a harvest celebration at the school, with the children performing a play they had practiced for weeks. Thomas, Eleanor, and James attended, sitting in the front row and applauding enthusiastically as Samuel played the role of a pioneer, and Grace recited a poem about autumn leaves. Afterward, as they drove back to the ranch under a canopy of stars, Grace fell asleep in Eleanor's arms, and the boys dozed against each other in the back of the wagon. "You've done wonders with that school," Thomas said quietly. Mrs. Henderson told me yesterday that enrollment is up and attendance has never been better. Hazel smiled, pleased by the compliment. The children are eager to learn, they just needed someone to believe in them. Thomas's gaze lingered on her face, illuminated by the moonlight. You have a gift for that believing in people, seeing their potential. As do you, Hazel replied. Look at how you've helped Samuel. He talks of nothing but horses and cattle and one day being a rancher like Mr. Thomas. Thomas chuckled. He's a natural, good head on his shoulders. They fell into comfortable silence as the wagon rattled along the familiar road. When they were nearly home, Thomas spoke again. Thanksgiving is coming up in a few weeks. I was thinking we might host a proper celebration, invite the ranch hands, maybe some folks from town who don't have family nearby. That sounds wonderful, Hazel said warmly. Eleanor and I could plan the menu together. And Thomas hesitated, then continued with careful neutrality. I thought we might invite Pastor Morris to join us, if you're amenable. Hazel glanced at him sharply, understanding the unspoken question. Pastor Morris would only be invited for one reason: to conduct a ceremony. Thomas, she began, her heart racing, are you asking what I think you're asking? He pulled the wagon to a stop, turning to face her fully in the moonlight. I'm asking if you might be ready to consider a more permanent arrangement for all of us. Hazel took a deep breath, emotions swirling within her love for this good, patient man, lingering grief for William, hope for the future, concern for her children. The children, she said softly. Have you thought about how they might feel? Thomas nodded. I have. And I believe they've already shown us how they feel. Samuel follows me like a shadow. Grace climbs into my lap for stories as naturally as if she's always done so. His eyes held her steadily. But what matters most is how you feel, Hazel. I won't rush you. In that moment, looking into Thomas's honest face, Hazel knew her answer with a certainty that surprised her. The love she had felt for William remained, a precious memory she would always cherish. But life, as Eleanor had said, went on. And Thomas Grant had shown her that her heart was large enough to embrace a new love, different but equally profound. Yes, she said simply. I'm ready, Thomas, more than ready. Joy transformed his features, making him appear years younger in the silvery moonlight. Truly. He asked, his voice rough with emotion. In answer, Hazel leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, a gentle, brief kiss that held the promise of 1,000 more to come. Truly, she whispered against his mouth. Thanksgiving Day dawned clear and cold, the first snow of the season dusting the distant mountains. Inside the Grant home, delicious aromas filled the air, roasting turkey, baking pies, fresh bread. Hazel and Eleanor worked side by side in the kitchen, while Thomas and the boys brought in additional firewood and set up extra tables in the main room. By noon, guests began to arrive: ranch hands and their families, Dr. Phillips and his wife, the Wilsons from the general store, several of Hazel's students whose families had other obligations, and Pastor Morris, who had agreed to conduct a wedding ceremony after the Thanksgiving meal. News of the engagement had spread quickly through Valentine, met with widespread approval and good wishes. Even Mrs. Henderson had made a special trip to the schoolhouse to congratulate Hazel, bringing a hand-embroidered tablecloth as an engagement gift. The Thanksgiving feast was everything Thomas had envisioned: abundant food, lively conversation, and the warm glow of community. Before the meal, he stood at the head of the table and raised his glass in a toast. Today, we give thanks not only for this food and this land, but for each other. For the bonds that sustain us through difficult times and sweeten the good ones. His eyes found Hazel's across the table. And I give special thanks for second chances and for the woman who has brought joy back into this home. Glasses were raised all around, accompanied by murmurs of "hear, hear," and warm smiles directed at the couple. After the meal and before the pie was served, Pastor Morris called for attention. Friends, he announced, we have another celebration today. Thomas and Hazel have asked me to join them in marriage right here, surrounded by those they love. A ripple of pleased excitement ran through the gathering. Eleanor quickly helped Hazel change into the simple but elegant blue dress they had secretly prepared, while Thomas donned a clean white shirt and his best vest. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, conducted before the crackling fire in the main room. Samuel stood proudly at Thomas's side, while James held Grace's hand, helping her scatter dried flower petals that Eleanor had saved for the occasion. "Do you, Thomas Grant, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to love and cherish in plenty and in want, in joy and in sorrow, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live?" Thomas's voice was strong and sure. "I do." "And do you, Hazel Remington, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to love and cherish in plenty and in want, in joy and in sorrow, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live?" Hazel looked into Thomas's eyes, seeing in them all the promise of their future together. "I do." They exchanged simple gold bands that Thomas had purchased on a trip to Cheyenne. When Pastor Morris pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas gathered Hazel into a gentle embrace, kissing her with a tenderness that brought tears to more than one observer's eyes. The celebration continued well into the evening, with music provided by one of the ranch hands who played fiddle and another who brought an accordion. There was dancing and laughter, apple pie and hot cider, and a general atmosphere of joyful festivity. As the evening drew to a close and the last guests departed, Thomas found Hazel on the porch, gazing up at the star-filled sky. "Happy?" he asked, slipping an arm around her waist. She leaned into his embrace. "More than I ever thought possible again," she admitted. "Though part of me feels guilty for being so happy." Thomas nodded in understanding. "I felt the same way after Caroline, like my happiness somehow dishonored her memory." He turned Hazel gently to face him. "But I've come to believe that the greatest tribute we can pay to those we've lost is to live fully, to embrace the love that comes our way." Hazel reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. "When did you get so wise, Thomas Grant?" He captured her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "About the time a certain stubborn widow and her 2 children turned my well-ordered world upside down." Their laughter mingled in the crisp night air, a promise of the many joys to come. Winter settled over Cottonwood Creek Ranch, transforming the landscape with blankets of snow and ice crystal mornings that glittered like diamonds in the sun. The newly married couple faced the season's challenges, together blizzards that prevented Hazel from reaching the schoolhouse, cattle that needed extra care in the bitter cold, pipes that froze in the pre-dawn hours. Thomas moved Hazel and her children into the main house, though he kept the foreman's cabin maintained for future use. The transition went more smoothly than anyone might have expected, the 2 families blending with surprisingly few conflicts. Eleanor, far from feeling displaced, seemed delighted by the expanded household. "This house was built for a family," she told Hazel one evening as they sat mending by the fire. "It's been too quiet for too long. Christmas brought new traditions." Hazel introduced her family's custom of reading A Visit from St. Nicholas on Christmas Eve, while Thomas revived his own childhood memory of hiding small gifts throughout the house for the children to find on Christmas morning. Together, they created a celebration that honored both their pasts while establishing something uniquely their own. As winter gave way to spring, Hazel discovered she was expecting a child. The news was met with unrestrained joy from Thomas and excited curiosity from the children. Samuel and James immediately began debating whether the baby would be a boy or girl, while Grace solemnly informed everyone that she would teach the baby everything it needed to know. Eleanor, practical as always, started knitting tiny garments and planning adjustments to the nursery that had stood empty since James had outgrown it. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Hazel found herself tiring more easily than she had with her previous children. By mutual agreement with the school board, she finished the spring term but arranged for a substitute teacher to handle the fall session, with the understanding that she would return to teaching after the new year if her health permitted. Summer brought long, languid days filled with ranch work, fishing expeditions, and evening gatherings on the porch. Hazel's belly swelled with new life, and Thomas found himself watching over her with protective attention that sometimes made her laugh. "I'm not made of porcelain, Thomas," she would remind him when he tried to prevent her from carrying a basket of laundry or reaching for a book on a high shelf. "Humor me," he would reply, his eyes twinkling. "I've waited too long for this happiness to take any chances." In late September, as the first leaves began to turn, Hazel went into labor during a spectacular thunderstorm that rattled windows and illuminated the night sky with jagged bolts of lightning. Eleanor sent James to fetch Dr. Phillips while Thomas paced anxiously outside the bedroom door, Samuel and Grace watching wide-eyed from the hallway bench. After 6 hours of labor, considerably shorter than either of her previous deliveries, Hazel gave birth to a healthy baby boy with a shock of dark hair and his father's determined chin. "He's perfect," Thomas whispered, cradling his newborn son with tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "Absolutely perfect." They named him William Thomas Grant, honoring both the father Grace and Samuel had lost and the one who had opened his heart to them. Little Will, as he came to be called, thrived in the loving chaos of the blended family. Samuel appointed himself official protector, James the designated teacher of all things ranch-related, and Grace the entertainer, singing made-up songs that never failed to make the baby gurgle with delight. As autumn deepened toward winter once more, the family gathered one evening around the fireplace, with baby Will sleeping peacefully in Hazel's arms. "Hard to believe it's been over a year since you arrived," Thomas remarked, his arm draped comfortably around his wife's shoulders. "Hardest year of my life," Hazel acknowledged, "and also the most blessed." Thomas pressed a kiss to her temple. "Do you remember what I said to you that first day at the cabin when I gave you my mother's revolver?" Hazel nodded, her eyes soft with memory. "You said I didn't have to face everything alone, not anymore." "Best advice I ever gave," Thomas said with a smile. "Applies to all of us, I reckon." Eleanor, sitting nearby with her knitting, looked up. "That reminds me of something our father used to say. No burden is too heavy when there are enough shoulders beneath it." James, sprawled on the floor with a book, raised his head. "Is that why you're always making me and Samuel carry in the firewood together?" The adults laughed, and even Will stirred in his sleep, his tiny mouth curving in what might have been a smile. Outside, the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, swirling in the light from the windows like silent promises. Inside, the Grant family expanded, reconfigured, and stronger for all they had endured continued their evening together. Secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them as they had faced the past, together. In the years that followed, Cottonwood Creek Ranch prospered under Thomas's leadership, expanding to become one of the most respected operations in Wyoming territory. Hazel eventually returned to teaching, though on a more limited schedule that allowed her to balance her professional satisfaction with her family responsibilities. The children grew and changed. James followed in his father's footsteps, showing a natural aptitude for ranching and a head for business that promised to serve the Grant legacy well. Samuel developed interests that surprised everyone, a talent for medicine that Dr. Phillips encouraged, suggesting the boy might consider medical school when he was older. Grace, with her quick mind and vivacious personality, excelled in school and developed a passion for books that hinted at a scholarly future. And little Will, with his father's determination and his mother's compassion, grew into a sturdy toddler who charmed everyone he met. 2 years after Will's birth, Hazel gave birth to twins, a boy and girl they named Daniel and Caroline, completing their family circle. Eleanor remained an essential part of the household, though she surprised everyone by marrying the town's widowed blacksmith when she was 43, moving into his home in Valentine but remaining a constant presence at the ranch. Through all the changes, the joys and sorrows, triumphs and disappointments that make up any life, Thomas and Hazel maintained the bond that had grown between them from those first uncertain days. Their love, built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine friendship, provided a stable foundation for their children and an example for the community. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Thomas took Hazel back to the hillside where they had ridden together that summer evening so long ago, the place where he had first allowed himself to hope they might have a future together. The view was just as spectacular as Hazel remembered. The valley spread below them, Cottonwood Creek winding through it, the ranch buildings in the distance looking small but solid against the vast Wyoming landscape. "I never imagined when William died that I could be this happy again," Hazel admitted, her hand clasped in her husband's as they sat side by side on a blanket. "I thought my life was over." Thomas brought her hand to his lips. "And I never imagined, after Caroline, that I would find someone who could heal that empty place inside me." His eyes, still as kind and direct as when they first met, held hers. "You saved me, Hazel Grant." She smiled, the lines at the corners of her eyes crinkling in a way he found endlessly charming. "We saved each other, I think, and our children." As they watched the sun begin its descent toward the distant mountains, Thomas pulled her close against the evening chill. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if those bandits hadn't attacked your stagecoach that day, if you had made it safely to Valentine?" Hazel considered the question. "I used to in the early days, but now I believe that somehow our paths would have crossed eventually." She turned to face him fully. "Some things are simply meant to be." Thomas nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Like a widowed teacher and a lonesome rancher finding each other in the vastness of Wyoming territory." "Exactly like that," Hazel agreed, leaning in to kiss him as the setting sun painted the world in gold around them, a fitting backdrop for a love that had begun in grief, but blossomed into something beautiful and enduring. As they rode back to the ranch in the gathering twilight, the lights of home glowing warm and welcoming in the distance, Hazel reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From the devastating loss of William to the uncertain days as a widow with nothing left, to this moment of profound contentment, it had been a path marked by both heartbreak and joy. But Thomas had been right. That day at the cabin when he first reached out a hand in friendship, she didn't have to be alone anymore. None of them did. Together, they had built something stronger than any one of them could have created alone, a family bound not just by blood or marriage, but by choice, by love, and by the daily decision to face life's challenges side by side. And in the wild, beautiful expanse of Wyoming, with its harsh winters and glorious summers, its dangers and its opportunities, they had found not just survival, but a life rich with purpose and meaning. As they approached the ranch, they could see the children waiting on the porch, James tall and lanky at 16, Samuel nearly as tall at 14, Grace graceful and poised at 12, little Will sturdy at 10, and the twins, 8 years old and inseparable, dancing with impatience. "They're watching for us," Thomas said, his voice warm with pride and love. "They always will be," Hazel replied softly. "And we for them?" Together, they rode toward home and all that awaited them there, not just for today or tomorrow, but for all the days to come. In a territory known for its wildness and uncertainty, they had created something rare and precious. A place of belonging, a haven of acceptance, a family bound by love that transcended blood and circumstance. And for Hazel, who had once lost everything, it was the greatest gift of all, the certainty that she would never have to face life's journey alone again.